Join me as I dive deep into the Civil War and try to uncover what really went down, separating fact from fiction. The American Civil War was one of the most defining and devastating conflicts in U.S. history, but to fully understand it, we need to look at what led up to this national tragedy. Decades of tension between the North and the South had been building, primarily over the expansion of slavery into new territories, economic differences, and debates over states' rights. The Missouri Compromise, the Kansas-Nebraska Act, and the violent confrontations known as Bleeding Kansas all pointed to a nation divided. The election of Abraham Lincoln in 1860 was the final spark, as Southern states viewed his anti-slavery stance as a direct threat to their way of life. What followed was a brutal, four-year conflict that would shape the future of the United States forever. In this video, we'll cover everything that happened in the Civil War, from its origins to its aftermath. The Missouri Compromise. The Missouri Compromise, enacted in 1820, stands as a significant milestone in the early history of the United States, representing a critical attempt to balance the growing tensions between free and slave states. To appreciate its profound implications, we must delve into the historical backdrop, the specific provisions of the compromise, and the far-reaching consequences it engendered. Historical context. By the dawn of the 19th century, the United States was undergoing a period of rapid expansion and transformation. The Louisiana Purchase of 1803, which encompassed vast territories previously owned by France, opened new lands for settlement and development. However, this expansion brought to the forefront a contentious debate. Should slavery be permitted in these new territories? This question was not merely academic. It struck at the heart of the nation's economic, social, and moral fabric. As settlers moved westward, the balance of power in Congress became increasingly precarious. By 1819, the Union consisted of 22 states, evenly divided between 11 free states in the North and 11 slave states in the South. The admission of Missouri as a slave state threatened to upset this delicate equilibrium, potentially granting the South a majority in the Senate. This raised alarms among Northern politicians and abolitionists, who feared that the expansion of slavery would become unchecked. The crisis intensified when Missouri applied for statehood in 1819. Representative James Talmadge Jr. of New York introduced an amendment to Missouri's statehood bill that aimed to prohibit the further introduction of slaves into the territory and to gradually emancipate those already enslaved. While this amendment passed in the House, it was blocked in the Senate, starkly illustrating the deepening sectional divide. Key provisions of the Missouri Compromise. The Missouri Compromise was crafted as a legislative response to this crisis, with several key provisions. 1. Admission of Missouri. Missouri was admitted to the Union as a slave state, thus allowing the institution of slavery to expand into new territories. 2. Admission of Maine. To maintain the balance of power, Maine was admitted as a free state, having separated from Massachusetts. This move ensured that the number of free and slave states remained equal. 3. Geographic boundary. The compromise established a geographic boundary for slavery in the remaining Louisiana Purchase territory. Specifically, slavery was prohibited in all territories north of the 36 degrees 30 minutes parallel, with the exception of Missouri itself. This agreement was largely orchestrated by Henry Clay, a prominent politician known as the Great Compromiser. Clay recognized the urgent need for a solution that would appease both pro-slavery and anti-slavery factions, understanding that the integrity of the Union depended on such compromises. Significance and consequences. The Missouri Compromise was significant for several reasons. Legislative precedent. It marked the first major legislative effort to address the contentious issue of slavery's expansion, setting a precedent for future compromises, such as the Compromise of 1850. Revealed sectional divides. The compromise highlighted the profound divide between North and South, as both regions viewed the balance of power in Congress as vital to their respective economic and social systems. Temporary peace. While the Missouri Compromise provided a fragile peace, its resolution was short-lived. The tensions it sought to alleviate would soon resurface, leading to further conflicts. The compromise was effectively repealed by the Kansas-Nebraska Act of 1854, which introduced the concept of popular sovereignty, granting settlers in new territories the power to decide whether to permit slavery. This led to violent confrontations known as Bleeding Kansas, where pro-slavery and anti-slavery factions clashed over the future of the territory. In 1857, the landmark Dred Scott decision by the U.S. Supreme Court declared the Missouri Compromise unconstitutional, asserting that Congress lacked the authority to prohibit slavery in the territories. This ruling exacerbated sectional tensions and propelled the nation closer to civil war. Long-term impact. The Missouri Compromise underscored the limitations of legislative measures in resolving the deep moral and economic divides surrounding slavery. It exposed the growing sectionalism that would dominate American politics for decades to come. While it delayed the onset of the Civil War, it did not prevent it. The fundamental divisions between the North and South continued to widen. The compromise served as a stark reminder that political agreements could only offer temporary respite in the face of profound societal conflicts. In summary, the Missouri Compromise was a crucial, yet ultimately insufficient response to the crisis of expanding slavery. It illustrated the deep-seated divisions that would culminate in the American Civil War, highlighting the nation's struggle to reconcile its ideals of liberty and equality with the harsh realities of slavery. The Kansas-Nebraska Act and Bleeding Kansas. A detailed examination. Introduction to Bleeding Kansas. Bleeding Kansas, a term first popularized by the New York Tribune, refers to the turbulent and violent period between 1854 and 1859, during which the Kansas Territory became a battleground for pro-slavery and anti-slavery settlers. This conflict was ignited by the Kansas-Nebraska Act, a significant piece of legislation that introduced the contentious principle of popular sovereignty, allowing the residents of the newly organized territories to determine for themselves whether to permit slavery. The Kansas-Nebraska Act, a catalyst for conflict. Passed by Congress in May 1854, the Kansas-Nebraska Act was championed by Democratic Senator Stephen A. Douglas. He sought to facilitate the construction of a transcontinental railroad and believed that organizing the territories of Kansas and Nebraska would help achieve that goal. However, the act effectively repealed the Missouri Compromise of 1820, which had previously established a clear boundary for the extension of slavery. 1. Popular sovereignty. The act's most controversial aspect was its endorsement of popular sovereignty, which allowed settlers in each territory to decide the slavery issue through voting. This principle was intended to calm tensions by giving the people a voice, but it instead opened the floodgates for conflict. 2. Immediate reactions. Almost immediately after the act's passage, settlers from both pro-slavery and anti-slavery factions flocked to Kansas, each eager to influence the outcome of the impending vote on slavery. This influx set the stage for violent confrontations. Escalation of violence. The struggle in Kansas quickly devolved into chaos. Pro-slavery settlers, many hailing from Missouri, formed armed groups known as Border Ruffians. These groups crossed into Kansas with the intent of swaying the vote in favor of slavery. Their tactics were aggressive and often violent. Ballot box stuffing and intimidation. Border Ruffians engaged in ballot box stuffing and intimidation of anti-slavery settlers, aiming to establish a pro-slavery territorial government. This blatant manipulation of the voting process incited further tensions. Immigrant aid societies. In response, Northern abolitionist groups, particularly those from New England, established immigrant aid societies that sent anti-slavery settlers to Kansas. These groups provided funds, supplies, and even weapons to bolster the anti-slavery cause, leading to an influx of settlers committed to opposing slavery. Notable incidents of violence. The violence in Kansas escalated into horrific confrontations, with atrocities committed by both sides. 1. The Sack of Lawrence. In May 1856, pro-slavery forces launched an assault on the anti-slavery town of Lawrence, Kansas. They burned buildings, destroyed printing presses, and inflicted violence on residents, demonstrating the lawlessness that had taken hold in the territory. 2. Pottawatomie Massacre. In retaliation for the sack of Lawrence, radical abolitionist John Brown led a group of followers to carry out the Pottawatomie Massacre. In a brutal act of vengeance in May 1856, Brown and his men murdered 5 pro-slavery settlers, further escalating the cycle of violence. 3. Guerrilla warfare. The conflict morphed into a full-fledged guerrilla war, with both sides engaging in raids, ambushes, and retaliatory killings. The Kansas Territory descended into chaos, becoming so lawless that federal intervention was deemed necessary, although efforts to restore order proved largely ineffective. Political and national impact. The events of Bleeding Kansas had profound implications for the United States. Symbol of division, Bleeding Kansas became a powerful symbol of the deepening sectional divide. Northern newspapers highlighted the violence to illustrate the moral depravity of the pro-slavery cause, while Southern publications depicted abolitionists as violent fanatics. Political fracturing. The conflict significantly impacted national politics. The Democratic Party, which had traditionally maintained support from both North and South, began to fracture along sectional lines. Meanwhile, the newly formed Republican Party, built on an anti-slavery platform, gained traction, particularly in northern states. Flaws of popular sovereignty. The violence in Kansas exposed the inherent flaws of the popular sovereignty doctrine as a solution to the slavery question. Instead of fostering local governance and peace, it led to increased violence and polarization. Long-term impact. Bleeding Kansas is often viewed as a precursor to the Civil War, with many historians considering it the first battles of the larger conflict that would engulf the nation. The repercussions of this violent struggle included hardening of attitudes. The brutality witnessed in Kansas hardened attitudes on both sides. In the North, the violence perpetrated by pro-slavery forces galvanized many moderates to join the abolitionist cause. Conversely, in the South, the perceived aggression from Northern abolitionists fueled fears of an existential threat to the Southern way of life, solidifying support for the institution of slavery. Prelude to Civil War. The events in Kansas served as a harbinger of the larger conflict that was to come. The violence and chaos that erupted in the territory foreshadowed the national struggle over slavery, showcasing how deeply embedded the issues were within American society. Political realignments. As the nation approached the 1860 presidential election, the divisions wrought by Bleeding Kansas contributed to significant political realignments. The Republican Party, having gained momentum from the anti-slavery sentiment, positioned itself as the primary opposition to the Democrats, who were increasingly split between Northern and Southern factions. Deterioration of compromise. The violence in Kansas illustrated that the United States could no longer rely on political compromise to address the slavery issue. The moral and economic divisions between North and South had become too pronounced, as evidenced by the inability of legislators to find common ground. Cultural narratives. The narratives surrounding Bleeding Kansas also played a crucial role in shaping public opinion. Abolitionist literature, such as Harriet Beecher Stowe's Uncle Tom's Cabin, drew upon the violence and suffering experienced in Kansas to galvanize Northern sentiment against slavery. Conversely, Southern newspapers and politicians used the events to paint a picture of Northern aggression and disorder, framing their defense of slavery as a necessary means of protecting their way of life. Conclusion. In essence, Bleeding Kansas was not merely a series of violent clashes over the issue of slavery. It was a critical juncture in American history that laid bare the profound divisions within the nation. The events that transpired in Kansas were emblematic of a broader struggle over human rights, economic interests, and national identity. While the Missouri Compromise had provided a temporary solution to the issue of slavery's expansion, the Kansas-Nebraska Act and the resultant violence of Bleeding Kansas shattered that fragile peace. The moral, political, and economic clashes that emerged from this legislation transcended mere territorial disputes. They reflected a nation grappling with its conscience and the fundamental question of freedom. Ultimately, Bleeding Kansas served as a grim precursor to the Civil War, illustrating the deep-seated animosities that would soon erupt into a national conflict. The struggle in Kansas highlighted the inadequacy of political compromise in resolving the moral dilemmas associated with slavery, marking a pivotal moment in the march towards civil war and shaping the trajectory of the United States for generations to come. Key abolitionists. Abolitionists were individuals and groups in the 18th and 19th centuries dedicated to ending slavery in the United States. They believed that slavery was morally wrong and campaigned through writing, speeches, political action, and sometimes direct intervention to abolish the institution. Prominent abolitionists included figures like Frederick Douglass, Harriet Tubman, William Lloyd Garrison, and Sojourner Truth. Their efforts, through publications like The Liberator and networks such as the Underground Railroad, played a crucial role in raising public awareness and building the momentum that ultimately led to the Civil War and the end of slavery with the 13th Amendment. Here are a few. Frederick Douglass. Frederick Douglass was a towering figure in American history, renowned for his work as an abolitionist, writer, orator, and advocate for human rights. Let's explore the key aspects of his life up to the Civil War. Early life. Frederick Douglass was born into slavery in Talbot County, Maryland, around February 1818. His birth date remains uncertain. Named Frederick Augustus Washington Bailey, he was separated from his mother, Harriet Bailey, early in life and raised by his grandmother. His formative years were shaped by the harsh realities of slavery, witnessing and experiencing physical abuse, hunger, and neglect. A pivotal moment came when Douglass was about 12 years old. Sophia Auld, the wife of one of his Baltimore masters, began teaching him the alphabet. Her husband forbade this, fearing that education would make Douglass unmanageable, but this only fueled Douglass's determination. He secretly taught himself to read and write, using newspapers, books, and any materials he could find, recognizing that knowledge was his key to freedom. Escape from slavery. In 1838, at the age of 20, Douglass made a daring escape. Disguised as a sailor and carrying borrowed identification papers, he traveled by train to New York City, a free state. There, he married Anna Murray, a free black woman who had supported his escape plans. The couple settled in New Bedford, Massachusetts, where Douglass took his new surname, inspired by the hero of Sir Walter Scott's poem, The Lady of the Lake. They built a new life in the North, far from the oppression Douglass had known. Abolitionist and orator, Douglass's natural eloquence and sharp intellect quickly brought him into contact with local abolitionists. In 1841, he gave his first public speech at an anti-slavery convention in Nantucket, where he impressed William Lloyd Garrison, a leading voice in the abolitionist movement. This marked the beginning of Douglass's career as a public speaker and activist. He became a lecturer for the Massachusetts Anti-Slavery Society, traveling extensively and delivering powerful speeches about the injustices of slavery. His compelling presence and riveting accounts of his life under slavery countered racist claims that enslaved people were incapable of intellectual and moral reasoning. Literary contributions. In 1845, Douglass published his first autobiography, Narrative of the Life of Frederick Douglass, an American Slave. The book was a powerful indictment of slavery and a personal testament to his journey toward freedom. It became an instant bestseller but also put him in danger of capture, prompting him to travel to Ireland and Britain. During his time abroad, Douglass gained widespread support and raised funds that enabled him to purchase his legal freedom. Upon his return to the United States in 1847, Douglass founded his own anti-slavery newspaper, the North Star, based in Rochester, New York. The newspaper's motto was, "Right is of no sex, truth is of no color, God is the Father of us all, and we are all brethren." Through this publication, Douglass advocated not only for the abolition of slavery, but also for women's rights, temperance, and education, leading to the Civil War. Throughout the 1850s, Douglass continued his tireless activism. He became a prominent critic of the Fugitive Slave Act of 1850, which required that escaped enslaved people be returned to their enslavers, even from free states. Douglass worked closely with the Underground Railroad, helping enslaved individuals reach freedom in the North and in Canada. He also engaged in public debates and speeches that called out the moral hypocrisy of the United States, juxtaposing its founding ideals of liberty and justice with the brutal reality of slavery. By the time of the Civil War, Douglass had become one of the most influential voices advocating for abolition, justice, and equality. This sets the stage for Douglass's critical role during the Civil War and beyond. Harriet Tubman. Harriet Tubman was an extraordinary American hero, known for her bravery, ingenuity, and dedication to the abolition of slavery. Let's delve into her remarkable life. Early life. Harriet Tubman was born into slavery around 1822 in Dorchester County, Maryland. Her birth name was Araminta Ross, and she was one of 9 children born to Harriet Green and Ben Ross. Life as an enslaved child was brutal. Tubman endured physical violence, malnutrition, and forced separation from her family. A defining moment came when she was a teenager. She was struck in the head by a heavy metal weight while intervening to protect another enslaved person from punishment. This injury caused lifelong seizures, headaches, and vivid visions, which she interpreted as divine guidance. Despite the hardships, Tubman grew up with a fierce spirit and a deep sense of faith, both of which would guide her throughout her life. Escape from slavery. In 1849, Tubman escaped from slavery, making a daring journey to Pennsylvania, a free state. Guided by the North Star and aided by the Underground Railroad, a secret network of safe houses and abolitionists, she gained her freedom. However, her liberty wasn't enough. Tubman was determined to rescue her family and others from subjugation. The risk of returning to Maryland was immense, with bounties placed on her head and slave catchers constantly on the lookout. Yet her sense of justice and her belief that freedom was a right for all people drove her back again and again. The Underground Railroad. Over the course of a decade, Harriet Tubman made approximately 13 missions back into Maryland, guiding around 70 enslaved people to freedom. Her courage and resourcefulness earned her the nickname Moses. Tubman never lost a single person on her journeys, despite the constant danger of capture and death. Her methods were ingenious. She traveled by night, used coded songs and signals, and relied on a network of trusted allies, both black and white. The Fugitive Slave Act of 1850 made her work even more perilous, but she persisted, leading people farther north into Canada for safety. Her work as a conductor on the Underground Railroad required strategic planning, quick thinking, and incredible resilience. She often disguised herself, used decoy tactics, and stayed one step ahead of those who sought to capture her. Tubman was known to carry a revolver, both for protection and to encourage any frightened escapees to stay the course, knowing that turning back could jeopardize the entire group. Abolitionist and activist, Tubman's activism extended beyond the Underground Railroad. She worked closely with leading abolitionists such as Frederick Douglass and William Lloyd Garrison. She spoke at anti-slavery meetings, sharing her story and raising funds to support the cause. Her firsthand experience and powerful oratory made her a compelling advocate for justice. She also collaborated with John Brown, the radical abolitionist who believed in armed insurrection as a means to end slavery. Tubman helped him plan and recruit supporters for his famous raid on Harper's Ferry in 1859, though she was unable to participate directly due to illness. Leading to the Civil War. As tensions over slavery escalated toward the Civil War, Tubman became increasingly involved in the fight for freedom on a larger scale. She joined the Union Army, initially working as a cook and nurse, but her knowledge of Southern terrain and her skill in leading covert missions led her to become a spy and scout. Her efforts were instrumental in weakening Confederate forces and liberating hundreds of enslaved people in the South. In 1863, Tubman led a military expedition known as the Combahee River Raid in South Carolina, guiding Union boats through waters infested with mines to attack plantations and free more than 700 enslaved people. This remarkable operation marked her as the first woman to lead an armed assault in the Civil War. Harriet Tubman's life up to the Civil War is a testament to the power of resilience, faith, and unwavering commitment to justice. Her story didn't end there. After the war, she continued to fight for equal rights and humanitarian causes. The election of Abraham Lincoln in 1860 was one of the most significant political turning points in American history, setting the stage for the Civil War and fundamentally reshaping the nation's political landscape. To understand its full impact, we need to unpack the historical context, the sectional divides, and the cascading ramifications that followed Lincoln's rise to the presidency. The election of Abraham Lincoln in 1860 was one of the most significant political turning points in American history, setting the stage for the Civil War and fundamentally reshaping the nation's political landscape. To understand its full impact, we need to unpack the historical context, the sectional divides, and the cascading ramifications that followed Lincoln's rise to the presidency. Fragmentation of political parties. The 1860 election occurred during a time of extreme polarization over the issue of slavery. The once dominant Democratic Party, which had managed to hold the Union together for decades through compromises, was unraveling. In the lead-up to the election, The Democratic National Convention in Charleston, South Carolina, collapsed in disarray when delegates could not agree on a platform regarding the expansion of slavery into new territories. The party split into two factions: Northern Democrats, who supported Stephen A. Douglas and his doctrine of popular sovereignty, and Southern Democrats, who nominated John C. Breckinridge and demanded federal protection for slavery in all territories. Additionally, the Constitutional Union Party emerged, made up of former Whigs and moderate Democrats. Their nominee, John Bell, took no firm position on slavery, advocating instead for the preservation of the Union above all else. This fracturing of the Democratic vote allowed Lincoln, the nominee of the relatively new Republican Party, to win the presidency with just 39.8% of the popular vote, carrying all of the northern states, but not a single southern one. Despite Lincoln's minority share of the popular vote, the Electoral College delivered him a decisive victory, a result that alarmed Southern leaders who saw their political influence slipping away. Southern fears and secession. Lincoln's victory sent shockwaves through the Southern states, where the Republican Party was seen as an existential threat to the institution of slavery. Although Lincoln repeatedly stated that he had no intention to abolish slavery where it already existed, Southerners feared that his opposition to the expansion of slavery into new territories would lead to its gradual extinction. The South's economy and social hierarchy were deeply dependent on slavery, and many Southern leaders believed that losing control of federal government policy meant losing their entire way of life. On December 20th, 1860, just weeks after Lincoln's election, South Carolina became the first state to secede from the Union. Over the next few weeks, 6 more states, Mississippi, Florida, Alabama, Georgia, Louisiana, and Texas, followed, forming the Confederate States of America by February 1861. These states declared that the election of a president whose opinions and purposes are hostile to slavery justified their secession. This unprecedented act signaled that the Southern states were prepared to go to any lengths to protect their slave-based economies and culture, even if it meant war. The failure of compromise. In the wake of secession, last-ditch efforts to preserve the Union were made. The Crittenden Compromise, proposed by Senator John J. Crittenden of Kentucky, aimed to extend the Missouri Compromise line westward, protecting slavery south of the line in perpetuity. However, Republicans, including Lincoln, refused to support any measure that would allow for the expansion of slavery, as they believed it violated their core principles. Without bipartisan support, the compromise failed. Meanwhile, President James Buchanan, still in office during the lame duck period before Lincoln's inauguration, took little decisive action to prevent secession. His belief that the federal government had no constitutional authority to force states to remain in the Union only emboldened the secessionists. Buchanan's inaction deepened the crisis, leaving Lincoln to inherit a nation already on the brink of war. The road to war. By the time Lincoln took office on March 4, 1861, the Union was already fractured, and the federal government controlled little more than a handful of forts and military installations in the seceded states. Lincoln's inaugural address sought to reassure the South that he had no intention of interfering with slavery where it already existed, while also making clear that secession was illegal and that he would defend federal property. He appealed to the better angels of our nature, calling for unity and peace, but the die was cast. The tipping point came in April 1861, when Confederate forces fired on Fort Sumter in Charleston Harbor. Lincoln called for 75,000 volunteers to suppress the rebellion, a move that prompted 4 more states, Virginia, Arkansas, Tennessee, and North Carolina, to secede and join the Confederacy. The conflict that followed would become the bloodiest war in American history, with more than 600,000 lives lost over the next 4 years. Political ramifications. Lincoln's election and the subsequent secession crisis had profound political consequences. The Republican Party, once a sectional Northern party, emerged as the dominant force in American politics for decades to come. The Democratic Party, meanwhile, was devastated by the war and the association with secession and slavery, particularly in the North. The war also caused lasting political realignments, shifting the center of national power from the agrarian South to the industrializing North. Moreover, the Civil War fundamentally redefined the relationship between the federal government and the states. The belief in state sovereignty, once a major political philosophy, was diminished, and the federal government emerged from the conflict with far greater authority. This shift laid the groundwork for a stronger, more centralized national government, a legacy that endures to this day. In the end, Lincoln's election did not just signal a change in leadership. It marked the beginning of a national reckoning over the moral and economic foundations of the United States. The political ramifications of his presidency and the war it provoked would continue to shape the nation for generations, laying the groundwork for the abolition of slavery, the rise of industrial capitalism, and the ongoing struggle for civil rights. Harper's Ferry. John Brown's raid on Harper's Ferry, which took place from October 16 to 18, 1859, was a bold and controversial attempt to ignite a slave uprising in the United States. Brown, a fervent abolitionist, believed that armed insurrection was the only way to overthrow the institution of slavery. The attack was meticulously planned and supported by a small group of dedicated followers, many of whom shared John Brown's raid on Harper's Ferry, a comprehensive analysis. Introduction. John Brown's raid on Harper's Ferry, which took place from October 16 to 18, 1859, stands as one of the most dramatic and consequential episodes in the lead-up to the American Civil War. This bold attempt to incite a widespread slave rebellion was fueled by Brown's unwavering belief that armed resistance was the only viable means to dismantle slavery in the United States. His raid, though ultimately unsuccessful, sent shockwaves through the nation, further deepening the divide between North and South. Supporters of John Brown. Brown's operation was not an isolated effort, but was backed by a group known as the Secret Six, a coalition of prominent Northern abolitionists who provided financial and logistical support for the raid. These supporters included Gerrit Smith, a wealthy philanthropist and political reformer. Smith was a staunch abolitionist who used his considerable wealth to support anti-slavery initiatives, including the Underground Railroad. George Luther Stearns, an industrialist committed to the abolitionist cause. Stearns supplied Brown with weapons and financial resources necessary for the operation. Franklin Sanborn. As Secretary of the Massachusetts State Kansas Committee, Sanborn played a crucial role in facilitating communication between Brown and other abolitionists. Thomas Wentworth Higginson, a Unitarian minister and militant abolitionist, Higginson firmly believed in direct action against slavery and endorsed Brown's radical approach. Theodore Parker, a transcendentalist clergyman known for his fiery sermons against slavery. Parker's influence extended beyond the pulpit as he advocated for direct intervention against the institution. Samuel Gridley Howe, a physician and social reformer, Howe was actively involved in assisting escaped slaves and promoting the abolitionist cause. In addition to these influential backers, Brown assembled a diverse group of 21 men, including his sons and both black and white allies. Notable among these were Osborne Anderson, a free black man who later documented the events of the raid, providing a rare first-hand account from within Brown's ranks. John Henry Kagi, Brown's second-in-command and a key strategist in the operation. Dangerfield Newby, a freedman who joined the raid in hopes of liberating his enslaved wife and children. Shields Green and Lewis Leary, two African-American men who believed in the necessity of direct action to overthrow slavery. The attack. On the night of October 16, 1859, Brown and his men put their plan into motion by seizing the Federal Armory and Arsenal in Harper's Ferry, Virginia, now West Virginia. Their objective was to confiscate weapons and distribute them to enslaved people, initiating an armed uprising that would spread throughout the South. Initial success. The raid commenced with precision and speed. Brown's men successfully captured the armory, took several hostages, including Lewis Washington, a descendant of George Washington, and severed telegraph lines to delay reinforcements. Critical miscalculation. Despite the initial success, Brown made a grave strategic error. Instead of retreating to the mountains with the captured weapons, he chose to hold his position, expecting enslaved people from the surrounding areas to join the revolt. However, no mass uprising materialized, and by morning, local militia forces had begun surrounding the armory, cutting off Brown's escape. Union response and the capture of Brown. As the crisis escalated, the U.S. government dispatched a military force led by Colonel Robert E. Lee, accompanied by Lieutenant J.B. Stewart. On October 18th, Lee's forces stormed the engine house, where Brown and his remaining men had barricaded themselves. Assault and capture. The assault was brief but intense. Brown and his men fought valiantly, but were quickly overpowered. Many of his followers were killed, and Brown himself was wounded and captured. Recognition of valor. Despite Brown's defeat, his courage did not go unnoticed. Even Lee acknowledged the determination and resolve of Brown and his men in their final stand. Aftermath and impact. Following the raid, Brown was swiftly tried for treason against the Commonwealth of Virginia, murder, and inciting a slave insurrection. His trial became a national spectacle and provided him a platform to defend his actions as morally justified. Trial and execution. Brown was found guilty and sentenced to death. He met his fate on December 2, 1859, facing execution with unyielding composure. His final words, written in a note before his hanging, ominously predicted the coming conflict. I, John Brown, am now quite certain that the crimes of this guilty land will never be purged away but with blood. National symbol. Brown's death elicited varied reactions across the nation. In the North, he was mourned as a martyr, his willingness to die for the abolitionist cause celebrated by figures such as Ralph Waldo Emerson, who compared Brown's gallows to the cross of Christ. Sectional tensions. In the South, the raid confirmed fears that Northern abolitionists were willing to use violence to achieve their goals. Southern leaders, alarmed by Brown's actions, began mobilizing militias and advocating for stronger measures to protect slavery. Political ramifications. The political landscape of the United States shifted dramatically in the wake of the raid. Democratic Party division. The party, which had previously maintained a fragile unity, fractured along sectional lines, with Southern Democrats hardening their pro-slavery stance. Republican Party growth. The raid strengthened the resolve of the nascent Republican Party, which capitalized on the growing anti-slavery sentiment in the North. Cultural impact. Brown's actions inspired literature, speeches, and art that continued to shape public discourse. Songs such as John Brown's Body became rallying cries for Union soldiers during the Civil War. Long-term consequences. John Brown's raid is often considered a catalyst that accelerated the nation towards civil war. His actions made it clear that the debate over slavery could no longer be resolved through political compromise alone. Prelude to civil war. Many historians view the raid as a precursor to the national conflict that erupted in 1861. It highlighted the deep moral and ideological chasm between North and South, demonstrating that the fight over slavery would ultimately be settled through violence. Martyrdom and memory. Brown's legacy persisted long after his death. His image as a martyr for freedom inspired generations of activists fighting against oppression, reinforcing his place as a pivotal figure in American history. Complications of abolitionism. Brown's radical approach sparked debates among abolitionists themselves. Some viewed him as a hero, while others, like Frederick Douglass, who had declined to join the raid, questioned whether such violent means were justified. John Brown's raid on Harper's Ferry was a defining moment in the fight against slavery in the United States. Though unsuccessful, it galvanized abolitionist sentiment in the North and heightened Southern fears, making civil war all but inevitable. His bold attempt to incite a slave uprising not only deepened the sectional divide, but also underscored the moral urgency of the abolitionist cause. In the end, Brown's legacy transcended his failed raid, cementing his place in history as a martyr for justice and equality. Hopefully, you've enjoyed this video. Please like, comment, and subscribe to Cyber Theo.